Okay, so as you've probably noticed, it's becoming a bit more uncomfortable here at the moment, and we've been informed by the management company that in the afternoon, if you look up, the sun is going to come over your heads, and what is pretty much this room will become a glass house. So it'll become unbearable in the afternoon. So conscious of that and health and safety and everybody's well-being, what we've done is we've changed the program a little bit. Sorry, Marin, I'm taking a little minute or two just to explain. So what we're going to do is we will do this coming session, Pathways for Europe's Protein Transition, chaired by Marin. What we're going to do is, Richard has kindly offered to cut his presentation, so Geert van Rooyen has 2 slides, I think, Geert, so we're going to put your slides into this session. And then for the discussion at the end, we'll ask the speakers and Matilda from Kerry to join us on the stage for that. So we will conclude then for lunch. Lunch was originally down for 1 hour. What we're going to propose is that you take your lunch, please come back in here. We're splitting into 2 groups. It's cooler up this part of the room. So session parallel, better get this right. Parallel 2 is here, ensuring safe, healthy and trusted alternative protein applications, and parallel 1 is upstairs. They will run for 1 hour, and then it will be concluded with tea and coffee, and if you want to stay for networking. So the idea is that we'll be completed by 2:15. as opposed to originally 4:30, 5 o'clock, something like that. And the posters, exactly. So we encourage, a lot of people went to a lot of trouble with the posters, so we would encourage you please to, we won't have the time because the idea is to get through the afternoon parallel sessions and then have time to walk around with the posters upstairs where it's a little bit cooler, okay? So apologies for the change, obviously it wasn't planned, but we're just trying to adapt and ensure everybody is as comfortable as possible. Okay, so without further delay, Marin, please, if you can come to the stage. Marin is the co-founder of the Protein Project, if you're not familiar with it. They've produced some excellent publications, most recently the Legume Renaissance, a Pathways for Legume and Faba Bean Production. So Marin, please, I'll leave it to you. Thank you.
Very good. It is indeed extremely hot, but this session is also going to be extremely interesting. So we'll be looking at first what a diet shift actually looks like on the plate. What does it mean for people, sustainability and profits? And then we'll try to answer one of the really difficult questions, but fundamental questions is, as we shift our plates in Europe and across the world, how do we ensure that the transition happens in a just way and that no one is left behind? Then we'll deep dive into policy and try to understand across Europe what type of policy instruments have been used in order to support a protein diversification. And then finally we'll end up with some recommendations from the projects themselves as to how we can ensure a sustainable transition of protein production and consumption that works for everyone. Now, this comes at an extremely timely moment in Europe. Some of you might be familiar, but with the protein plan and the livestock strategy, long awaited, they will come out on the 7th of July, so in less than 2 weeks. And so the outcomes, the discussions of today have already in the past fed some of those discussions in the commissions and will need to continue to do so. Because, as you probably all know, a plan is typically only the very first start of a transition. And so the inputs that you all develop today and that is being discussed will be needed in the years to come to accompany us in the transition. And so, introducing the first speaker, Esther, a senior scientist on food security at Wageningen University, covering topics related to transition in the food supply chain, such as circularity, biodiversity, and the protein transition. And as I said, she will be covering future EU diets, the pros and the cons of the dietary shifts, looking at the 3 Ps, implication for people, planet, and profits, and then also looking at the role, the potential role of novel proteins into this shift. Over to you. Thank you.
So thank you for the introduction. My presentation will be as brief as possible to allow us all to have a nice break and cool down a bit, because I'm also heating up, I have to say. My presentation is a brief summary of work package 7 of the GIANT LEAPS project. which aims to optimize the dietary shift from the current protein ratios, which are 70% based on animal-based proteins and 30% based on alternatives. We want to shift to a 50-50 ratio and even optimize to a 30-70% ratio, where the majority of the proteins come from alternative sources. In our research, we looked at two levels. We looked at food level, so at the products, and we looked at diet level. And I'll briefly touch upon the results at these two levels, and I would also like to invite you to go to the poster session, where Mathilde Milane has a poster at food level and Merel Daas has a poster at optimizing the diet. So first, at food level, if you want to make such a transition, for example, from a meat product to a meat analog, there are various criteria that play a role. Of course, it should be safe, it should be healthy, so meet the nutritional requirements. It should be profitable for the companies that produce these type of products, and it should reduce the environmental impact, so the greenhouse gas emissions, the land use, and the water use, etc. Now, in order to make a fair comparison between different products, we would like to integrate all these criteria to come to a final conclusion. And we did that by using multi-criteria decision analysis. And an example is given on the left side in the table. I don't want you to read all the numbers, but just to get an idea of how it works. So in the left column, we have the beef steak, and next to it, we have the three alternatives. So we have a lentil steak, potato steak, and a soybean steak. And we evaluated that at several elements, so at safety, nutrition, environment, and profit, and their underlying criteria. We gathered data as much as possible in the project, and we normalized the values in order to make comparisons between these different criteria, because as you can imagine, like land use is in square meter, but microbial contamination is in CFU per gram, so that's a bit difficult to compare. So that's why we normalize them, and you see these values between 0 and 1, and the more green, the better it performs at these criteria. The far left column indicates the weight, so the importance of the different criteria that was established based on a stakeholder survey. And then if you combine these normalized values with the weights that were assigned to the different criteria, you come up with a total sustainability score that is depicted in the figure on the way, all the way to the right. And there you see the comparison between these beefsteak and the three alternatives. And the further to the right, the better the product scores on sustainability. So what you see is that, in this case, soybean steak performs better than beef, but potato steak scores worse. So multiple aspects need to be included to assess such overall sustainability. That were the results at food level. Of course, we wanted to move on to the diet, because you don't only eat a meat analog, you have multiple products on your plate. So we looked at what does it mean, such a protein transition at the diet level. We started with substitution modeling, and we saw that with limited number of substitutions, you already can achieve quite substantial environmental environmental benefits. And we did this for 4 countries in Europe to reflect the different regions. You see here an example for Finland, greenhouse gas emissions and land use. The top bar indicates the current situation, and if you move then to a 50-50% plant-based and animal-based products, or 50-50 plant and novel proteins, you see already a decrease in greenhouse gas emissions and land use. And if you reduce it even further to 30-70%, you see the bars going down. So this has a tremendous impact on the environment. But of course, it should also meet the nutritional requirements, and we saw that in some cases we needed targeted reformulation and fortification strategies in order to have a good quality product that meets the nutritional requirements. And connected to that, we saw that if you have a transition, especially if you move to the 30-70% ratio, we cannot meet all the requirements with only the plant-based sources. We need also these more novel upcoming proteins like the microalgae, single-cell proteins, insects, etc. So they can really contribute to adequate intakes of protein and some of the nutrients. Once we knew this, how this worked, we moved on to optimizing these dietary shifts. Again, just one example for one country, and we did it for males and females. On the x-axis, you see the environmental impact, so we want to have that as low as possible. On the y-axis, you see the Haney score, which is a measure for the nutritional quality, and that should, of course, be as high as possible. And these purple, or on my screen it's light blue, dots indicate the current situation, and we saw that if we substitute with just 1 or 2 products on your plate, we already move to the up left corner. So it is possible to replace products on your plate and become more environmental friendly and have a good nutritional quality. When we looked at these optimized diets, so this is all based on modeling work, we saw these diets were composed of higher amounts of dairy and meat analogs, but also higher consumption of plant-based products as such, so fruits, vegetables, cereals, etc. And if we dived into these meat and dairy analogs themselves, we saw they contained a range of protein sources. So apparently the model did not pick one protein source as being the best. It is a range. It contains almonds, oats, lentils, potato, cricket, etc. All this research was combined into policy recommendations that are published in Policy Brief 7 that's coming out soon, but I can already share the outcome of the research. So we recommend to leverage the dietary shift's dual benefit on both human health and the environment. We saw in our modeling approach that it is possible to have such a transition and have a good impact both on the environment and health, so we should strive for this. We also recommend to focus on the protein diversification because we saw there is not one protein source that ticks all the boxes. You need a palette of all these proteins and they can complement each other. Furthermore, we promote a dual strategy towards both whole foods and processed foods. So you don't only need to eat these meat and dairy analogs, but you can also decide to increase your plant-based plant-based product consumption as well. Furthermore, which is a more broader recommendation from the GIANT LEAP project as a whole. Oh, something wrong, it's okay. We saw that there were many data gaps, and we tried to fill these data gaps, but after 4 years of research, we have to take the conclusion that we didn't manage to fill them all. So we need a collaboration between industry, science, and government to generate high-quality open access data, and that has been mentioned by previous presenters as well, so we really recommend to do this. And finally, we should aim for a long-term strategy to enable to make this protein transition possible. And this also nicely connects to a recent EEA report which indicates both we need a protein diversification and this long-term strategy in order to achieve a dietary shift. And to conclude, we want to stress that you need small and consistent but long-term steps that will lead in the end to giant leaps in this diet transition that will benefit both the environment and human health. Because, consumers need to be convinced to eat more novel proteins. Producers need to have the time to produce these products and also have the investment to be able to become profitable, etc. So there are many small steps needed, but in the end we think we can achieve giant leaps into this dietary transition. And that brings me to the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much. And when looking at the greenhouse gas numbers that you looked at on a hot day like today, you would think, well, let's diversify our plates, let's start a protein transition. But unfortunately, it's often much more difficult, and that's what we see with policymakers in Brussels, but across Europe as well. And one of the reasons it's difficult, other than people love meat, is that there's this recurring question: what's going to happen to farmers? How do we ensure that if we do a transition to a different plate like we've seen, it's good for the environment, it's good for so many reasons, but can this be good for farmers as well and the rest of the value chain? And that question is exactly what Richard is going to answer, research officer in crop science department at Teagasc as well, and also managing the Horizon project VALPRO Paths. Richard, the floor is yours to tell us how we can get to a just transition by identifying the key challenges across the value chain and how we can move to a protein transition that works for all.
Okay, thank you very much, Marin, for the kind introduction. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Richard Lynch. Marin just introduced me, but I work, and I was very privileged to work on the project VALPRO Paths as the project manager for the last number of years. And in that role, I was exposed to an awful lot of the challenges which farmers and the different stakeholders are facing across the supply chain in Europe when we talk about plant proteins. So the core of my talk is really about how do we ensure that when we're transitioning, we're all about transitioning towards alternative proteins. How do we ensure when we're transitioning to that stage that we bring everybody along on the value chain and that we make sure that everybody's challenges and their concerns are addressed. So the first slide I'd like to show you is really to pinpoint 3 of the main stakeholders, actors in the value chain, and look at what their main questions, concerns might be around moving towards more alternative proteins. So if we take specifically from the plant-based protein side of things, the crop producer, they have certain questions around, is there an actual market for the product, for the crop that they grow? How do they maximize yields on that crop then? Once there is a market, how can they maximize the yields on that? And then for the processors, they want to know, well, should they invest in a plant processing facility? Because as we heard from Zvonimir this morning, it's not just a case of a couple of million, we're talking about 50 to 150 million euro. So it's a large investment required by an awful lot of venture capitalist funds and other funds like that. So they want to know, should they invest? Questions like Marco from our own project asked, is there actually a market for it? They're all concerns that have legitimate concerns. So they want to know, should they invest? Is the infrastructure there, or is the machinery there that they can purchase? Can they get a consistent supply of the raw materials then if they do build their facility, and what technologies they should use? So Mark in the earlier talk and some other speakers spoke about some of the technologies. Then for the food manufacturer, they want to really know in terms of the plant-based food market, what products are the best really to put out there, and I'll speak a little about the work we did in Valpro Path towards that. So with that, we conducted an analysis of some of the main challenges that are experienced by the plant-based protein sector in Europe. And my colleagues in Teagasc and other organisations across the project had a look at grey and academic literature. They conducted a number of stakeholder workshops and interviews with key stakeholders, but they also had one-to-one expert interviews with certain, we'll say, representatives of crop growers across Europe. And these are just, I know it's very small on the slide, but it's just to give an indication of some of the reports we got back. So really what we did is we reduced this template really. There's a lot more detail behind this. We have a full report that's available on the website. But in this template, it just indicates, it highlights some of the main challenges that are experienced at the different stages of the value chain. So we broke it down by stage of the value chain. And what I'm going to do is just highlight maybe some of those stages and some of the innovations or solutions that we've found within Valpro Path to try and address those. So if we take the very first challenge or gap that's out there in terms of advancing plant protein, there's an issue with the lack of varieties that's there, and Ewan touched on it this morning, that if you see this table, this is the one he was referring to this morning, this is a graph we produced in the project. You can see that obviously for your mainstream crops like wheat, pea, soya being slightly mainstream, there's a lot more emphasis on varietal diversification. Whereas if you look at your chickpea, faba bean, lentil, lupin and so on, very few varieties available for farmers. And we know why. Possibly there's not a market available for those farmers to actually, once they grow the crop, to sell it into. So why would the seed companies produce the seed if farmers are not willing to grow it? So it's a kind of chicken and egg situation we need to address a bit as well. But we have looked a bit at this in Valpro Path. So we had 5 different regions in Valpro Path, different paleoclimatic zones, and we looked at basically what were the best crops, protein crops that they could grow in those regions. So the regions there, Ireland, Portugal, Germany, Denmark and Italy, we tested a number of crops that are more suitable in those regions. So for example, northern Germany it might have been lupin, in Ireland it was faba bean, in Portugal it was peanut, but we tested other crops. And the varieties within those crops then that were most suitable we had a look at. But we didn't just test for yield and certain agronomic parameters, we also tested for food parameters as well. So we looked at protein quality, protein yield, starch, fibre, things like that within the fat content within these. So we wanted to know how they would stand up if they were being put into the food value chain further on. So that QR code is actually active. I know it's very small for you to scan, but just to reiterate what Paul said, at the very back of your little lanyard, you'll see there's a QR code for the full programme of today, so you get all the presentations on that. In terms of cultivation and production, there's a lack of farming knowledge. So there was a great amount of farming knowledge there for growing legumes in Europe for a number of years, but that's been lost through generations just because they didn't grow it and it wasn't passed on, that knowledge. So we have a responsibility as researchers and then further on to extension specialists to pass that knowledge out there. And knowledge around simple things like what are the actual rotational benefits of putting a legume crop between 2 cereal crops. We all know this, I'm sure, in the room, but farmers sometimes don't understand. They can't really put value on that. So that's where we need to probably get that across. And there is tools that's been developed, like one we developed, but there's many others within the ValPro Path project. Just simple decision support tools to tell a farmer if you plant your crop at the right time, if you plant a specific variety, if you plant it at specific sowing depth or sowing rate, this is the type of yield you might expect. So it gives the farmers a bit more confidence, or the growers, when they start growing the crops. And then obviously we know there's issues around yield variability in protein crops. Probably it's based on the fact that the knowledge isn't there on how to actually grow them as much as it would be for a cereal crop. So very interesting publication that came out that was co-funded by ValPro Path, looking at the different agronomic factors that are affecting yield variability in protein crops, specifically faba bean and soya bean. And one of the speakers in the afternoon, Maritz Reckling, is going to speak a bit more in detail about this. Then in terms of processing and packaging, look, I'm sure everybody in the room knows there's inadequate infrastructure to actually process that plant protein, or that protein crop, into a higher value opportunity for food. So we need people like Svanemir and Juha-Pekka to come into the room and to start really driving this forward to bring that to fruition. But we need to address some questions like, should this be centralised? Should we have one in Finland and one in Ireland, or should we have it a bit more centralised and try and co-share those facilities in some way? There are questions we need to address, and one of our colleagues in Wageningen is also working on a model to try and optimise that in terms of plant protein. There will be publications soon to come out of that. Also, we need to make sure, as Mark mentioned as well, we need to valorise all the byproducts from this processing. So that's another important point we need to take into consideration. And then in terms of the application of that, well, we know at the moment protein crops are being used for feed predominantly, but I suppose it's not novel that they're being used for food, but maybe their application in certain foods can be more novel. So what I mean by that is that and a very important point that Svanemir said this morning is about getting it into the mainstream kind of diet, food culture in Europe. And to do that, we bring it into the everyday things that consumers take in, beverages, their carbohydrates, whether it's pasta, which is obviously a big consumable in Mediterranean Europe, and our breads and confectionaries. So we need to make sure that we're bringing in this into it as a raw ingredient. And if we can do that, we get it out there a bit more into the ether. Then in terms of the alternative applications, our colleagues at CSIC, and again, all the posters upstairs, I'm sure some of you tried to venture up in the heat, but the posters upstairs expand on these details a lot more. But they've looked at producing certain biomaterials from residue waste from plant processing. So they've looked at pea pods and peanut shells, and they've produced absorbent pads like medical bandaging and so on, or utensils, eating utensils, all from the byproducts, we would say, from processing of plant proteins. And then in terms of your materials and your distribution, your marketing and the distribution, there's an issue around brand recognition. We all know the story of how something goes in a supermarket shelf and within a day or two then it disappears. So one of our colleagues, I can see Marco down there, has worked very hard to develop this a brand called the Magno Burger. He also produces a number of other meat alternatives. And what he's done is he's tried to, in some way, I assume, Marco, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what I've picked up, you've tried to mimic in ways what meat packaging would look like, to try and bring it to the fore, but also give it its own identity in the marketplace. So one way in which he's done that, he's put a little QR code, and we've done a carbon tracking tool. We developed that within our project, with one of our partners, Farm B. So again, that carbon tracking tool just gives the product a bit more weight on a supermarket shelf, more recognition. And then in terms of logistics, storage, one simple solution, and we have a speaker, Ricardo, who came kindly the whole way from Argentina to present to us in this afternoon. He's going to speak about hermetic bagging, which is vacuum seal bagging at about a half ton to a ton size, that you can store and ship small quantities of these legumes, whether it's the raw material or it's the flour or the concentrate or isolate. You can ship them between manufacturers. So somebody like Marco isn't obliged to buy 20 ton in a lorry. of something that he mightn't use, he can buy it in smaller quantities and build his business that way, and other companies similar. So that's, again, there's a poster on that, more details, and Ricardo, I'm sure, would happily address questions on that. And then finally, just a disclaimer, this is ChatGPT, this image, but it's using information I got from an interview I recently done with one of our partners, not Svanemir, but one of our partners that are producing loop and isolate. And they basically were trying to describe the issue, the challenge they have with conflicting pulls towards research and marketing of their product. So to start off as a small company, and they're very eager to get their product to the best state that they can for the marketplace. But once they get it to that state, then they have to make sure it sells on the supermarket shelf. So then they have to start from the small pool of investment that they have, which they've already spent a lot of in capital infrastructure. They have to start pulling from that to start investing in marketing. And they have to compete against some of your big multinational marketing campaigns on the supermarket shelf. To do that is a very difficult thing to do, and it's a difficult decision to make as to where do you stop advancing your product development and you start pushing it into marketing. So that's one of the conflicts and concerns that we've found. You'll notice I don't have a solution for this. So that's probably where maybe you all here in the room can start thinking of solutions for this. But it definitely is something, if we want to bring it to the next stage, we have to think of. And I'm sure funding is one mechanism, but there's other mechanisms around that. Maybe co-shared facilities or something like that. So ultimately, very last slide, as you'll happily know, is just to say that really when we talk about a just transition, we have to make sure we address all the stakeholders' concerns and that we bring everybody along in the stories. So projects such as ValPro Paths and Giant Leaps, we try to bring in as many commercial companies and partners like that to try and bring the whole value chain along in a symbiotic fashion. That's it. Thank you very much. Just before you do clap, just to say, if you need further information on the gap analysis, I know Maeve is going to present a little bit about it as well, but you'll find it on the ValPro Paths website, and just a few acknowledgements from the partners that developed the data for us. Thanks. Sorry, just also to say that a shameless plug for Raphael there from Euroveg, but they had a meeting yesterday with a group of farmers just to see would they transfer their farming system towards more plant proteins, alternative proteins. And it was very positive as far as I know. I know Raphael has taken it, does a great picture for your website, I'm sure, but he has a couple of these outputs, reports from that meeting. They're available. I think I'll put them up here at the front. We don't have one for everyone in the audience, but you will find it on the website, and it is very valuable information in this. It fits in well with the just transition. Thanks.
Yeah, it fits really well because I had the chance to be at the event yesterday, and actually the Commissioner of Agriculture also shared some of the recognition of the challenges that you have identified and already reflecting on some of the policies that can support it. Now, we typically tend to think of policies as something that can help the sector, but policies can also hamper the sector. Actually, policies have made some of Esther's slides illegal. I don't know if you've spotted it, but it was written lentil steak. That is not allowed anymore. That is forbidden. So that can also really be problematic. So we really need to also reflect on, yes, it's important to think of policies in a way that can support the sector, but what are also some of the policies that are trying to hamper and kill it in the bud. Now, that's my transition to policies, and therefore also to Maeve, who will talk. She's a principal research officer also at Teagasc, also working at the University College in Dublin, and also serving on Ireland's Bioeconomy Research Centre. And Maeve will share with us an analysis of some of the policy instruments across Europe that have been put in place, understanding the role that they play in this transition. Over to you, Maeve.
Okay, so I'm a great fan of the KISS principle, keep it simple. So I'm going to have 3 simple messages that I'm going to work through for you this afternoon. So we've heard a lot about the value chain, but I suppose want to explain it a little bit more as a framework. It's a very useful diagnostic tool to identify gaps and areas of activity within the plant protein and other alternative protein value chain. So Richard would already have talked to you about the various activities that were undertaken across the value chain in Valpro Path. And then obviously value chains don't just happen. They need something to either catalyse them or to change behaviour or to speed something up, and that's where policy instruments can come in. And there's a huge range of policy instruments available. I think when we talk about supports from policy, we tend to think in a very limited perspective. So I'll just give you some illustrations in terms of the wide range of instruments that are available and necessary for their transition. And then I'll just bring us to kind of a more, I suppose, abstract but still important kind of concepts of food systems perspective. We're talking about here individual proteins, individual value chains, but really all of these need to happen in the context of a food system, and changes need to happen in the food system for alternative protein value chains and the changes associated with those to become embedded. So we had some illustrations already about the value chain and the analysis we did for that, and Richard called out some of the examples, but I just want to highlight here some recent reports on plant protein didn't actually look at the input stage, so the farm inputs. And we've talked a little bit already about varieties and breeding, but from some analysis that colleagues in Zalf did, we know actually there's a huge scarcity in terms of inputs for pest, disease and weed management also on the legume side. So that's another significant gap that happens even before things get to farmers. So farmers, as Richard pointed out, have limited varieties, limited knowledge, but also there's a limited repertoire of tools available to help them to grow these crops. There's also problems of yield instability, which obviously make the venture risky for farmers. There's a lack of processing techniques, which we've been covering, certification and standards, and some lack of familiarity with consumer preferences. And I suppose really I've just pulled out one example from each of those, but you can see fixing one isn't going to be the solution. We need to look at solutions right along the value chain to get these get plant protein into mainstream. And then across the bottom, there's a whole heap of policy aspects that haven't been fully addressed. And obviously, the absence of coherent policy frameworks is a challenge, and we all very much welcome the forthcoming protein plan that we're expecting from the European Commission at the start of next month. So further information on that and the analysis that underpins that analysis, the graphic that was presented there is available on a very user-friendly story map that we have on the website, and just acknowledging again colleagues from Teagasc who contributed to that and colleagues from Zalf who contributed to that as well. So as I said, value chains don't happen by themselves. You need to do some, there needs to be some catalysts or supports available from the policy side. So we did some policy analysis to look at so when you talk at policy level, people often talk about policy coherence. So the agricultural policy needs to be coherent with the environmental policy and the health policy. But where actually our analysis drills down a little bit more to look at individual instruments that have been deployed at regional and national level within member states across Europe to look at how they can catalyse this change. And that work was done in particular by my colleague Amy O'Leary in Teagasc. So the question we asked when we did this analysis is what types of policy instruments have been proposed to increase European plant-based protein production and consumption in published protein strategies and action plans. So we don't have any European level one yet, but there are a number of documents that have already analysed, that have already developed protein strategies and protein plans, and that's what we analysed. And we looked at different types of instruments. We classified them as economic, regulatory, persuasion, and procedural instruments. And oftentimes when you're talking about policy instruments, there's a nice analogy I heard somewhere else about carrots, sticks, and sermons. That covers the top three. So the carrots are the economic instruments, the sticks are the regulatory instruments, and the sermons, they're the persuasion instruments, where you're trying to influence behaviour, you're trying to influence norms to get people to change behaviour without giving them an economic incentive or a regulatory kind of stick to address them. And the procedural instruments then are the kind of cross-cutting instruments that help to bring people together in clusters or for various purposes, and I'll give you some examples of those in a minute. And just to illustrate the documents that we looked at Austria, Denmark, France, the Netherlands, Ireland and Flanders at their various protein strategies and action plans that they developed, and that was kind of around the early 2020, 2021, those types of years. As I said, we organise those according to 4 categories: the carrot, stick, sermons, and the procedural. And when we look at this here, we can see there were actually 309 different types of policy instruments when we looked at them. So oftentimes we talk about, these are the 2 we often tend to talk about, grants and funding and subsidies for farmers. But if you look at, as I said, if we look at these kind of from a simple perspective and look at the carrots, only 16% of the policy instruments that we looked at were the carrots. And then within that, pub grants and funding and subsidies, they're just 2 examples there. Obviously, the regulatory ones are fairly clear, but the persuasion ones, all the information campaigns, the education, the training, they're all very important. And Richard also pointed out about the advisory services and all of the kind of activities that they need to work on. They would fit into that persuasion type as well. But if you see the majority of the instruments that we looked at, the 64% are the cross-cutting procedural type instruments, and they're the ones whereby you're bringing people together, you're having collaborative planning, you're having public-private partnerships, you're having task forces, you're having working groups, and all of these are very important policy instruments as well. And even, the VALPRO Path and the GIANT LEAPS, these are projects that are generating knowledge, but they're also creating networks and collaborations and structures that are very important policy instruments in their own right as well. So we will have a database that it's a very simple database that just kind of outlines the different types of policy instruments that have been used in the different strategies, and that will be made available on Zenodo through open access before the project finishes. So then I suppose just to bring, again, I was saying we need to move beyond value chains to take a more kind of food systems perspective and a more integrated perspective. And we've been talking in GIANT LEAPS has done a lot of work in other non-plant-based protein value chains. And I suppose there's a question, are these individual value chains competing, are they complementary, or are they independent? And when you think about, from a marketing perspective, you think about share of stomach, they're probably competing. But then if we think about the work that Andre was talking about, or the previous speaker was talking about, we can see from a nutrition perspective, they're actually very complementary. But if we think about, take it from a broader food systems perspective, we realise they're actually hugely interdependent. So for example, if you have a plant protein and you're extracting protein from it, you then have the starch that's left, but you also have a byproduct that can be used for insect protein, and then that insect protein is fed to animals, and then those animals can produce manure that's improving the organic matter for more crop production. So we need to have a much more integrated perspective in terms of how are these interdependent and complementary, because otherwise we're shifting problems around, and the environmental impacts, there could be unintended consequences at regional level that we don't understand. So we need to look at these in a much more integrated way and recognising they're not parallel value chains, they're very much interdependent value chains. And I suppose just to close off then, the protein transition is just one component of a broader food systems transformation. So we're not just trying to fundamentally reshape how we produce and consume food. We have to look at governance structures, we have to look at power relationships, we have to look at economic incentives, and we have to look at cultural practices, because they shape what is consumed and how it is produced. And the protein transition, it can act as an entry point. We know it can improve environmental outcomes and dietary health, but really it needs to become embedded. So interventions must go beyond incremental directional shifts, which you have when you have a protein strategy, but you need to embed it to address systemic barriers and long-term transformation goals to embed the change. So the strategy is very much welcomed, but it needs, or the protein plan that's coming is very much welcomed, because it'll give that directionality that we need, but we have to think from a much broader food systems perspective and power dynamics and economic incentives and all of those kind of issues to figure out how can we actually embed this change. So just to conclude, the value chain framework is a very useful diagnostic tool to identify gaps for value chain development, and we need to address all of those gaps. There's no point in just working on one or two. We need to systematically address all of them. There's a wide range of policy instruments that are available to support this transition, and we need to kind of look at the broad range that are there and maybe consider some of those that have not yet been deployed. Carbon taxes, for example, are one that haven't been deployed, and I suppose there's questions about whether that would be effective or not, but there are other policy instruments that haven't even been deployed beyond the 309 that we identified. And directionality is important, but to embed that change, we need to have broader food system transformation. Thank you for your time.
Very good. Moving on to our last speaker, and thanks a lot, Maeve, for putting the context as well, moving to policy, and so important as well to first understanding what is there what has worked, what hasn't tried yet, instead of every time reinventing the wheel. Now, our last speaker is Hans. You've been 42 years of experience in food safety and nutrition, and you've worked across universities, industry, and government bodies. 42, which is also the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. For those who get the reference, for those who don't, please read The Hitchhiker Guide to the Galaxy. But so you will almost give the answer to everything today, because you will share the policy recommendations that have emerged out of this program, which hopefully can help us to have a transition that works for all. Hans, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thanks, and for those that are interested, this week I passed 43 years. And I always tell my kids I'm only 25, until at some point in time they said, then you are younger than we are. Anyway, good. We go for the policy briefs, final presentation. Policy brief, we produced a series in GIANT LEAPS, and we do that for a certain purpose. So there is a rationale for, for writing these policy briefs. They are not scientific documents, because these relate to scientific papers, but the policy briefs are short documents. They provide evidence and advice to policymakers. So they are translated in some way. And as such, these are a tool based essentially on project results. And that's how we started it. We had 4 years to draft them, and you will see them. So and they are intended to create general awareness. 9 were planned, and 9 you will get. The first 3 of policy briefs we started 4 years ago already, and they address important and relevant general issues, because we could not wait for 4 years starting to write them. So 9 policy briefs are planned. 1 on integrated food policy, and you already have seen the outcome of these in the presentation of Esther earlier on in this session. 2 on public health and consumer education, 3 on food safety, 1 on agriculture and aquaculture, and 2 on environment and circularity. The general structure of the policy briefs that we have chosen is as such. They start with the title, of course, and we'll see them in due course. Then a series of short recommendations. We acknowledge that policymakers may not have days and weeks to read all these documents, so we bring the important messages very much up front. Short recommendations. And then an associated call for actions on stakeholders, governments, scientists, as well as industry. Once we're through that, it typically takes a page or so, we more elaborate on the individual recommendations. We provide additional information, background information, and we acknowledge all the people that contributed, as well as the project and the EU. So, the first policy briefs we can see here. This one is the policy brief on protein. It's titled Achieving a Healthy Diet in a Sustainable Food System, the Crucial Role of Protein Intake and Adequacy. It's not surprising that GIANT LEAPS comes with a policy brief in this end. So, this is the main page, and here you can see already that we identified 7 individual recommendations, and of course I can read them out, but let's say you can spend some time when you click on the link of the published recommendation just to read it all in detail. So there's 7 recommendations in 3 different areas, and there's 4 calls for action. So this is when you read this and understand this, you're almost there. Anyway, at the end of the document, you will see the people that contributed to this endeavor. That's around 20 people. Most, but not all, are part of the GIANT LEAPS project. We have also a couple of invited experts. And each policy brief will also give reference to the GIANT LEAPS project, and Paul is the contact person. And all the policy briefs are intended to be published in the Zenodo database. So that's policy brief number 1. Policy brief number 1, if you go in much detail, and of course I will not see that, this is the policy brief in all the full details, 10 pages. Okay, that's a quick read of 10 minutes. That's something you could ask for a policymaker. Please do this when you can't sleep at night or so. So that's the policy brief. It's published now on Zenodo. since about a week ago. I'm very proud of it on behalf of the entire project. So the second policy brief is on food safety. There's many issues in the area of food safety, and some of them already passed by yesterday and today. The second policy brief is on food safety, and again we have a series of recommendations, 7 and 3 calls for action. Again, I will not expand on the details. You're cordially invited to read it on the Zenodo web page. So here you go. So first 2 are done. The third policy brief is on novel foods. This is not ready yet. There's some minor tweaks that need to be addressed and discussed, etc. But it's, I think, 95% is ready already. And then there's other policy briefs. Number 4 on consumers' insights to encourage the dietary shift. That is ready, and it remains to be established whether today, but at least this week, it will find its way to the Zenodo database. So that's number 4. Number 7, same story, it's ready, and that can also be published any time now. And you have seen already the excerpts from that policy brief in Esther's presentation. So 4 and 7 also down. The rest, number 5 on food allergy, 6 on sustainability, 8 on agriculture and aquaculture, and 9 on circularity. They are in a very far way of development, so I would consider that also 95% available, and we will certainly make sure that prior to the end of the project they're all in the public domain. Okay. That's all what I want to say, unless thank you for your attention, and I hand back the floor to Marie.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Yeah. He will present now. All right. Good, we have a change of programs because of the heat, as was mentioned before. We'll give Geert van Rooyen the floor in a minute. Before doing that, just wanted to wrap up this part, just sharing at least what I got as main takeaways from the 4 presentations. So Esther, I think if there's one takeaway is, if we don't want our brains to fry any further than today, we should consider protein diversification. Secondly then, Richard, we need to ensure that the value chain is included in its reflection toward a protein diversification, and it is a just transition, and there are still questions that need to be answered. Then Maeve, great analysis of the landscape of policy instruments that both learn of what exists already, but also reflect on maybe what doesn't exist yet and what could help us to ensure this transition work. And then last but not least, Hans actually showed us what we need to do, read 10 pages, and then we'll basically know how to bring it all together. So hopefully this can also feed into the coming discussions on the Common Agriculture Policy, the Protein Plan, and many others that will shape the protein future of Europe for the decades to come. And so then I give the floor to Geert van Rooyen. I'm sorry, I have no idea what Geert is going to present, but I'm sure he has just a few slides and will do a great job. Thank you very much, Geert.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Geert van Rooyen. I'm working at ILVO, Flanders Research Institute of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food. And normally I was asked to introduce the outcomes of the portfolio analysis that I performed with some colleagues of Aarhus University. I hope that some slides will pop up in a minute. It was asked to summarize the findings out of that portfolio analysis as a kind of introduction towards the final session this afternoon. But okay. I can already say that a lot of the outcomes of the portfolio analysis were addressed already this morning, so I'm happy to hear that they align, which is good news. And I'm also happy to see that within Valpro Paths and GIANT LEAPS, some of them have already been addressed. Yeah. Yes? Ah, okay. So it means, yes, perhaps a short introduction on what we have done. So the portfolio analysis means we have analyzed several EU projects which work on alternative protein sources. So we started with around 80 selected projects, then we downsized it to 30, and then eventually to 10 projects, 10 selected projects. And there we analyzed all the outcomes, and that's what we summarized here. So here you can see the title, of course, and also the link to the report. It's a 70 pages report. Summarizing it in 2 slides is not that easy, but I will try. But if you want, you can read it through this link or on the SCAR website, where it's also published. So I will limit it to the needs that came out of the out of the portfolio analysis, and I listed them up within the different stages of the value chain. And here on this first slide, you will see the primary production, the downstream processing, and also the product development. And so regarding primary production, and first of all, the protein-rich crops, we saw that there are limited breeding programs. There is a lack of knowledge, regional knowledge to grow those protein-rich crops. And also we see, for example, that there is a link between the yields and the climate zones within Europe. So a first need that came out is, of course, transition pathways integrating first agronomy, but also genetics and socio-economic context across different geoclimatic zones. And already mentioned also this morning our further development of farmer decision support tools, and also increased engagement, training, and education of the farmers. And then the last 2 points are regarding the more novel proteins. Then I'm thinking of microbial proteins, proteins from microalgae. Here we see a need for further strain optimization, for example, in balance between yield and sustainability goals. But also resolving scaling constraints is also very important, still an issue. Also, for example, in the insect sector, this is an important issue. Then regarding the downstream processing, here we saw, and it's also mentioned this morning, problems regarding industrial scaling of the processes. So here we see a need for investments, funding tools, and follow-on investment for scale-up. And also the ultra-processed foods, less processed foods, balance with ingredient performance is an important topic I think that we should address in the future. And then we also saw there is a large heterogeneity in the raw materials. So also here we can address this by developing flexible biorefinery concepts regarding process and infrastructure. Then regarding product development, food and feed, here we of course see there are problems, sensorial problems, constraints regarding texture of the products. So here I think a need is to improve these things by new, mild or other processing technologies to retain functionality of the proteins, but also removal of flavors, and very important, keep in mind to ensure food safety and the nutritional value of the protein sources. Regarding feed, also here there is still a challenge and a need for improved feed formulations. And we also see there is need for a broader feeding tests. I mean here over different species, and also on a longer term to see what's the long-term effect of these proteins. For example, if we look at allergenicity, already mentioned this morning, or accumulation of certain contaminants, and so on. And then ensuring the safety, I already mentioned, with optimized risk assessment methodologies and also validated processing methods. And then if we move to the second part of the value chain, I come to the consumer part and also sustainability and regulatory and policy. So starting with the consumers, here we saw in the different projects that there is a problem with the familiarity of the consumer with those proteins, new protein sources, and also a certain skepticism towards those proteins. So here I think there's a need for more clear and more transparent communication towards the consumer, and also, as I mentioned in the former slide, also further product optimization and reformulation is needed, and also more culinary integration within the diets of the consumer is important and an important challenge and need. And then, of course, also the visibility in the shelves, in the retailers. Also, the price is very important because currently these type of products are more in the higher price class than, and so they limit the availability for all consumers. So this is also important. And then it is also important to get more insights into the behavioral insights of the consumer, deeper insights. For example, what is the impact of pricing? What is the impact of the presenting on the shelf on the behavior of the consumer? Then what also came out of the portfolio analysis was regarding sustainability. Two aspects, and that was also addressed by the former speakers already. There is a need for more harmonized LCA framework and also a broader integration, also accounting for co-products, circularity benefits, soil carbon effects, and so on. And then there is a main focus, let's say, in the sustainability analysis on environmental sustainability, but it is even important to also address economical and social sustainability, as was also addressed by the former speaker. Economical aspects are at least as important and a key point, a crucial point in the further development, and also, for example, impact on public health as a social sustainability aspect is also important to include and integrate this all in the sustainability assessment. And then the last point are the regulatory and policy aspects. And here we see that came out of the different projects, a bit overarching, that the novel food legislation is of course complex, and it is not adapted for let's say, emerging fields for innovation, and also regarding, for example, what I wanted to say, labeling of products. There's also confusion, not really clear. So here I think there are also aspects and need for reviewing and adapting novel food regulation to facilitate the innovation, but also clear and harmonized regulatory approaches to boost transparency, innovation, and consumer acceptance. And then as a last point, I think it's important to integrate all this information, so co-creation and involving different partners within the value chain, and to close the gap between supply and demand. So this was a bit very short, summarized the outcomes of the portfolio analysis. But if you are interested in more details, I invite you to read the full report. Thank you for your attention.
All right, last thing between you and lunch is a few questions. So if anyone has some questions for any of the 5 previous speakers, then this is your moment. Yes, over there. Can we bring a mic?
Hello, I have a question for Hans. I don't know where he is.
Where's
but,
Hans?
he's gone.
It's coming from behind you.
Hello. I didn't see a policy brief on processing. And we've heard all through this morning the benefits of processing for alternative proteins. So is it in the pipeline?
The short answer is no. But if people are interested in collaborating on an additional policy brief, we can discuss it either within or outside the remits of the project. So yes, identify yourself over lunch to me.
Very good. 10 policy briefs would be a very nice round number, so maybe we should go towards that. Any other questions? Yes, in the back.
Yeah, hello, my name is Moritz Reckling from Zahl from Germany. I have more like maybe a statement, maybe then someone can decide who wants to answer. Basically, we talk about like alternative ways of food and extraction and processing and so on. And that's nice, that's new and alternative. But if we really want to change large areas of our agricultural landscapes, we probably need to use protein crops for feed, because there's the largest demand, and I think we are somehow not hitting that topic of the livestock. We always present or talk about the alternatives, but not the livestock as a transition path to more sustainable agricultural systems. Maybe someone wants to comment on that.
Any of the speakers that, yeah, here you go. Very brave. I don't know if this one works, but...
Hello. Yeah, Moritz, I could have told you this last night when we were having a steak together, but anyway, I can tell you now in front of the room. Yeah, one thing I suppose in ValPro Paths, I can't speak for Giant Leaps, but we focus an awful lot on the added value opportunities. But absolutely, if we can't grow protein crops in particular at a large enough scale, then facilities like Zvonimir's can't actually, like I was just chatting to him earlier on, he can't establish because he's not guaranteed supply. But the biggest problem is if we can't guarantee that there's an income for these farmers that grow the protein crops, they're not going to grow it in the first place. So their first protocol is obviously as animal feed. So there's opportunities there around maybe a premium feed stuff. I mean, we know in particular in Ireland we're doing some work around, it's a low carbon feed, we know that in terms of a low carbon protein source as opposed to soya being imported. So that's one opportunity as well to get a premium. But it's who pays along the value chain to keep farmers in business. And to keep farmers in business, they need to grow it at a way bigger scale so that other businesses then can justify spending 150 million on a plant to build alternative proteins. So it's a kind of we definitely need the feed industry, and the food is going to be almost a niche end of that till it develops further, till the market grows for it. My personal opinion. I'm sure you have a lot more. And it's opened the floor as well, I'm sure, to other people if they want to address some of the questions.
Is off then? Oh, it comes back. Fantastic. Maybe from a policy perspective, at least feed is very much a priority. When what we've seen of the drafts of the protein plan, the only target that is in the plan is related to the high meal feed self-sufficiency. So politically, I think there's a lot more weight that is being given to the feed. And I think moments like today is just a moment to also say, hey, food is also important, but we recognize that they, of course, all sit together. Any other question? Yes, please. Mic to the front. You make them run. Oh, there's a mic here. Perfect.
I don't think this... Oh, yeah. Just a quick one, really, and I don't know who from the panel wants to respond, but this comment about regulation, and I was at a meeting for an EU project where they've got several SMEs on alternative proteins produced by precision fermentation. And actually, one of the issues there that was raised wasn't actually to do with the novel foods regulation, but even when EFSA has produced a positive opinion, that it then gets stuck with the member states. And there's a really good example of this with Impossible Burger leg hemoglobin, where it's been 2 years, a positive opinion from EFSA, right? It's on sale in the United States. The EU has not approved it. and that is because it's stuck with the member states. So I don't know, you're talking about a regulatory framework, that's the end of the chain, but that to me seems kind of crazy. What can we do to make that happen? Be brave. I love it.
Nobody here willing to stand up and answer that. We get her.
In the interest of going to lunch. No. I'm aware of that particular process. Whoops, sorry. And I think this is one of the things, and you mentioned the protein plan and policies and strategies, is that I think it's very easy to write stuff down on paper. And until you come up with logistic, or not process issues such as that, Europe being Europe, obviously EFSA gives an opinion, and it's up to member states to decide then whether they choose to adopt it or pause it or ask for more information. So I guess that's that seesaw of prioritization. How much do people really want to prioritize? You know, these don't use the word alternative, other protein systems versus some of the others that we have at the moment, versus some of these sometimes bureaucratic challenges that exist. So at times, people, I say that generically, it should be much easier to get past these things. So I share your frustration in regard to that one.
I think one of the aspects as well that you mentioned too is because a lot of the discussions we've had today have entered the domain of the culture war, where it has become extremely political and very difficult. I mean, we've seen it in countries where cultivated meat, for example, was banned before it was even on the market. I don't know if that's something that we know of many other products that has ever happened. So taking that into account, I do think that, and that's the good point of, it's not only about what we put on paper, it's not only about the right scientific advice, it's also about building power and political coalitions that allow to actually bridge that and show that the transition can be just, but that changes need to be made. And so that's why those are very complementary to one another. I don't know if we do any other questions or if we go for lunch. 15 minutes lunch, and then we come back here. And if you can't eat it in 15 minutes, then come back, and then an announcement. Yeah?
Sorry, just before we head off to lunch, just one quick group photo. If you can just move to this side of the room, and the photographer will be up there. Just a quick photo. Thank you very much.